What happens when the unstoppable force of human logic collides head-on with the immovable object of divine revelation? Throughout history, great empires have conquered territories using fire, steel, and blood. However, in the 4th century before Common Era, a completely different invasion spread through the Near East. It did not come to destroy cities, but to conquer minds. On one side stood the Greek world, a civilization that worshipped reason, geometry, and the beauty of the naked human body. On the other side stood the small Jewish people, a nation of shepherds and priests that worshipped an invisible, infinite, and jealous God, a God who strictly forbade the creation of any image or statue. A historian summarized this anthropological collision with a masterful phrase. The Jew asked, "What must I do?" The Greek asked, "Why must I do it?" The Greeks believed in the holiness of beauty, while the Jews believed in the beauty of holiness. How is it possible that, faced with the seductive and overwhelming Hellenistic culture that assimilated all other peoples of antiquity, Judaism not only managed to survive, but ended up stealing the intellectual tools of its conquerors to strengthen its own faith? Today, we unearth the mystery of the Jewish Paideia, the exact moment when Jerusalem met Athens, and how this war of ideas ended up sculpting the intellectual foundations of the entire Western civilization. Welcome to the battle where philosophy tried to assassinate faith, but ended up making it immortal. To understand the origin of this cultural and socio-political earthquake, we must go back in the annals of military history to the year 334 before Common Era. At that precise moment, a young Macedonian king of boundless vision crossed the Strait of the Hellespont with an army of 32,000 infantry soldiers. Alexander the Great not only destroyed the armies of the immense Persian Empire in legendary battles such as the Granicus River and Issus, but he brought with him a weapon of assimilation much more lethal and persistent than his phalanxes: Greek culture. The Greeks considered their civilization too superior for the peoples they called barbarians, but Alexander dreamed of a unified world empire under the same intellectual umbrella. Upon conquering the Near East, the Greeks enveloped the defeated nations in what historian Max de Monte describes as an immense cultural hoop skirt. Inside this structure, they introduced their wares of art, science, architecture, and philosophy, constituting what is known as exportable Hellenism. Hellenism was not simply a system of government. It was a comprehensive way of understanding existence, based on hedonism, the worship of physical beauty, dialectics, and the pleasures of life. With the implacable law of the victor taking all, the small territory of the Jews in the region of Judea came under the political domination and the overwhelming influence of this new Greek civilization. Unlike The brutalities of the Assyrians or the Babylonians in past centuries, the Greek threat to Jewish survival was insidious and profoundly seductive. It was the pin-up culture of antiquity, an irresistible bait of sophistication. Under the impact of daily commercial and social associations, Jewish society began to fracture and transform. Jews of all social classes began to assume Greek names with the same naturalness with which names are anglicized today in the modern world. They abandoned their traditional clothing and began to use the Greek tunic. And even worse, to the horror of traditionalists, young Jewish priests abandoned their sacred duties in the Temple of Jerusalem to go compete naked in Hellenistic gymnasiums and stadiums. The Greek language infiltrated religious writings, and majestic Hellenic architecture began to dictate the design of Jewish synagogues themselves. The assimilation was so deep that the Jews of the diaspora, especially those in the vibrant and cosmopolitan city of Alexandria in Egypt, lost the ability to speak and understand the original Hebrew language of their ancestors. This linguistic loss caused an unprecedented socio-political event, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, known as the Septuagint. Although this act made the Jewish sacred texts accessible for the first time to the intellectuals and philosophers of the pagan Greek and Roman world, preparing the ground for later religious revolutions, it also symbolized the immense danger of Jewish identity being swallowed and dissolved forever in the gigantic ocean of Hellenistic thought. The great anthropological question was inevitable. Would the Jew become just another Greek, losing his historical memory and his sacred covenant? Or would he find a way to resist the most elegant and attractive assimilation in human history? The historical knot of this anthropological collision soon tightened until it reached a bloody breaking point. The growing adoption of Greek customs unleashed the fury of traditional religious leaders. Deeply devout men, known as the Hasidians, began to cry out with a voice of thunder against the debauchery, immorality, and idolatry that the culture of the gymnasiums and theaters had infiltrated into the Holy Land. The accumulated tension finally exploded in the 2nd century before Common Era, in what popular history remembers as the Revolt of the Maccabees. However, rigorous archaeological and historical reading reveals a much more complex and uncomfortable truth. This conflict was not initially a patriotic uprising of oppressed Jews against the tyrannical Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes, as is often simplified. In reality, historical records demonstrate that it was a fierce and brutal Jewish civil war. It was a revolt initiated by anti-Hellenist Jews against the Hellenist Jews who had corrupted the priesthood. Antiochus Epiphanes only intervened militarily later, responding to this internal rebellion. Although the Maccabean War managed, against all odds, to temporarily re-establish an independent Jewish kingdom in Judea, the Maccabean military leaders ended up succumbing to the same palace intrigues and Hellenization they had sworn to destroy, leading the state to its eventual collapse under the legions of the Roman general Pompey. Armed and military resistance had failed to stop cultural influence. But the real battlefield was not in the hills of Judea, but in the minds of scholars. It is at this precise moment of crisis when the most fascinating and least understood figure of this period emerges. Philo of Alexandria, a man who lived between the year 20 before Common Era and the year 50 of the Common Era. Philo was the scion of the richest, noblest, and most deeply Hellenized Jewish family in all of Egypt. He spoke Greek and Latin with unsurpassable fluency and elegance, mastered classical literature, but could barely speak a word of the Hebrew of his ancestors. Philo faced a dangerous scenario of high political tension when the Roman Emperor Caligula plunged into madness and megalomania, demanded to be venerated as a living god. The pagan citizens of Alexandria, envious of the immense economic and social success the Jews had achieved in the city, took advantage of the Jewish refusal to worship the emperor's statue to unleash looting and massacres. Philo was sent to Rome as an ambassador to reason with an imperial psychopath, managing through tact and diplomacy to avoid the total annihilation of his community. However, Philo's greatest achievement was not political, but philosophical. Observing that the Jewish elite and the Greek intellectual world despised the Hebrew Bible as a primitive text of desert shepherds, Philo undertook the monumental task of dressing the Jewish divine revelation in the sophisticated clothes of Greek metaphysics. Philo, an ardent disciple of the philosopher Plato, postulated that the infinite and transcendent God did not influence the material world directly, but through a spiritual intermediary, a concept he called the Logos, that is, the Word Divine. Through a meticulously allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament, Philo argued that Judaism was, in fact, the supreme instrument that allowed humanity to achieve moral perfection, and that the sacred Torah was the only true path toward mystical union with divinity. Without knowing it, Philo of Alexandria was forging the conceptual framework that would later be adopted by Christianity in its Gospels. But for Judaism, his work demonstrated something revolutionary. The abstract logic of Athens could be used to defend and exalt the unshakable faith of Jerusalem. The climax of this anthropological history is the supreme demonstration of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of cultural extinction. After the total destruction of Jerusalem and the forced exile by the Romans, Jewish leaders and thinkers faced an existential abyss. The strict and primitive laws of the nomads and shepherds of the 5 books of Moses no longer seemed sufficient to respond to the complex legal, ethical, and commercial challenges of a dispersed urban and cosmopolitan life throughout the Hellenistic and Roman Empire. Jewish youth deeply imbued with Greek skepticism, demanded answers that simple blind faith could no longer provide. Herein lies the great revelation. The Jewish sages of subsequent centuries did not reject the Greek world, but rather engulfed it. The rabbis had privately studied Greek philosophy and the scientific method. Armed with the metaphysical thought of Plato, the analytical rigor of Aristotle's logic, and the precise deductive methods of Euclid's science, Jewish scholars approached the sacred Torah with a completely new and incomparable set of intellectual tools. They developed incredibly sophisticated and scientific methods to stretch, reinterpret, and expand the fabric of the Mosaic laws so that they fit perfectly into the complex existence of the Hellenistic world. This rigorous, logical, and refined method was called the Mishnah, the Hebrew word for repetition, which would later expand to become the vast and intricate world of the Talmud. The long-term consequence of this astonishing historical event is one of the greatest ironies of the development of civilizations. In their initial clash with the Greeks after the conquests of Alexander the Great, the Jews were unprepared because their absolute faith did not require logical proofs. Logic and philosophy are born from skepticism, which they lacked. But forced to defend themselves, they borrowed the weapons of logic and dialectic from the Greeks themselves. By doing so, they opened the Pandora's box of reason, creating a perpetual and vital tension between faith and intellect that would give birth to Jewish philosophy and medieval science. The Paideia, that sacred, cultural, and educational tradition of the Greeks, was destined to die when the empires of Greece and Rome collapsed in the dust of history under the barbarian invasions. However, it survived because the Jews became, completely accidentally and unexpectedly, the intellectual heirs of the Greek tradition. The Jewish faith, irrevocably enriched by abstract thought and Hellenic logic, proved to be immensely stronger and more resilient than Greek thought lacking faith. The Greeks, as a people and a world power, disappeared into the shadows of antiquity, but the Jews, using the structures of the Hellenic Paideia to preserve the morality of Jerusalem, survived to transmit this dual pillar of faith and reason to the entire civilization of the West. They transformed the threat of assimilation into the very machinery of their cultural immortality. Archaeology, the history of ideas, and anthropological records reveal to us that the true battle for human survival has never been won exclusively with armies, but with the capacity for adaptation and intellectual assimilation of the knowledge of our adversaries. The Jewish Paideia demonstrates to us how a small people managed to save themselves from extinction not through closed-mindedness and dogmatism, but by boldly integrating the mathematical logic of Athens with the deep faith of Jerusalem. thus laying the unshakable foundations of the modern Western civilization that we all inhabit. Now, the question is for you. Do you believe that in our contemporary era, it is possible to achieve a similar balance between the rigor of science and the principles of faith? Or are we doomed to have logic finally destroy all sense of spiritual transcendence? I invite you to leave your deepest arguments and to generate a rigorous debate in the comments section. If you value this level of intellectual demand, historical depth, and academic rigor, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and support the video with a like. This is part of our series, Chronicles of Thought. Until the next chapter on our channel, Jewish History, Evidence and Truth.